My life might have been tougher than the average person's. I didn't have a dad, and it was just my single mom who raised me all by herself. We were estranged from our relatives, so Mom was all alone in her efforts. She managed to send me to college, but years of hardship took their toll, and she passed away due to illness around the same time I graduated. After that, I had no family left. I landed a job at a regular company and met my wonderful husband, Tony. Tony, an executive at a client company, was a bit older than me. Having grown up without a dad, Tony was a reassuring and reliable figure for me. One day, I forgot some important documents at the client's office. Realizing this, I decided to rush back without telling my boss, intending to retrieve them. However, I didn't have a pass to enter the client's building, which my boss usually handled. Standing clueless in front of the client's office, an employee I had met earlier came running out with the documents. That was how I met Tony. Knowing my situation, Tony handed me the documents with an innocent smile and said, "Let's keep this our little secret." I fell for that smile and pursued him eagerly. It didn't take long for us to get married, and I found happiness. We weren't blessed with children, but every day was joyful. Tony, who always made me laugh, rescued me from a lifetime of loneliness. Just as I vowed to spend my life by Tony's side, we discovered he had cancer, already at stage 4. The doctor broke the news to us, and I was devastated. Tony deeply regretted leaving me alone in the end. But just before our 10th wedding anniversary, Tony passed away. Feeling lonely again, I was contemplating my solitude when suddenly, my father-in-law George proposed, "How about living together?" George was the only person who genuinely rejoiced and celebrated our marriage. Initially, when Tommy and I decided to marry, I had no family, so I was met with skepticism from Tommy's circles and relatives. Some relatives even opposed our marriage. However, George never cared about me having no family, and after the marriage, treated me like his real family. Tommy's mother, Marie, had passed away when he was young, so George had been living for many years with his real sister, Lily. Maybe that's why George was so handy and could manage all household tasks. He was also a great cook, often visiting our home to treat us with delicious meals. Lily, who lived with George, was single and didn't have a steady job. She used to earn quite a bit from door-to-door sales. But since that company went bankrupt, she struggled to find stable employment and was doing odd jobs. Most of the living expenses were covered by George's income, but a few years ago, George's legs grew weak, and he quit his job. They were barely getting by on his small earnings and pension. Knowing that George, who handled household chores, wasn't in the best health, I had been helping out at his place from time to time, even when Tony was alive. George would always apologize with a regretful look, saying, "I'm sorry I've become a burden because of my condition." I'd reply, "Don't worry about it. I'm good at housework, and I'm happy to see you well." Not knowing what it's like to have a dad, I was genuinely happy to take care of George. Tommy, knowing I considered George like a real dad, was always happy to send me off to help. However, Lily didn't feel the same way. Whenever I went to help, she would meet me at the door and say, "So you're here to butter up again. You're an outsider, you know. No matter what you do, you won't get any inheritance," with a spiteful look. I would always deny it, saying, "No, that's not my intention." But Lily would repeat the same line every time I visited. Despite her continuous sarcasm towards me, Lily never attempted to do any housework. Ideally, Lily, who had been living there all along, should have been the one doing the chores. But she would always go out and not return until late at night. Even when she was home and saw me helping, she would just hurl insults at me and then retreat to her room, seemingly satisfied. George noticed this behavior and warned Lily, but it had no effect. He then apologized to me again, saying I'm sorry because of this. Even though I didn't mind taking care of George, living together would mean facing Lily every day. I asked for some time to think about George's offer. After all, living alone after Tommy's passing was indeed unsettling. Having someone reliable around is completely different, especially since the offer came from George, who was like a dad to me. Despite Lily's harassment, I concluded that I could endure it to live a better life. I strongly preferred returning to a home with George over going back to an empty house. Later, I moved in with George, bringing only a few belongings. I was familiar with George's house, knowing where everything was except for the inside of Lily's room. Whenever I passed by, I could smell cigarette smoke, but her door was always closed. When I offered to clean her room occasionally, she accused me of being a thief. No way, Don't enter my room without permission. You might steal something. I protested. I would never do such a thing. You can't be sure. After all, you have no family to trouble, right? Every time Lily spoke to me, she would use words like outsider and remind me of having no family, knowing these were the words that hurt me the most. She knew I couldn't retort and deliberately used them. Once her door was half open and I could see inside. Confirming Lily wasn't there, I peeked in to find cigarette butts, alcohol bottles, and trash scattered on the floor. I hesitated for a moment, but knowing Lily would accuse me again, I quietly closed the door. Since Lily was mostly out during the day, I could spend the day in peace by avoiding her in the mornings and evenings, enduring the harsh treatment. This life continued for several months. Lily's harassment persisted, but during this time, George's health deteriorated day by day. Recently, walking became difficult for him, leading to more bedridden days. His health worsened, catching colds more frequently. Despite hospital visits, his condition did not improve, and a year into living together, he couldn't get out of bed anymore. I suggested hospitalization, but George stubbornly refused. Seeing this, Lily loudly accused me in front of George. Ever since you came to this house, George's health has been declining. Are you putting something in his food, I wonder? George looked at his sister but no longer had the energy to admonish her. Then, turning to me, he wore the same apologetic expression as before. Perhaps he was worried that if he were hospitalized, Lily would torment me even more. I continued to care for George while trying to ignore Lily's constant badmouthing. Lily didn't care for her own brother at all. She only entered George's room to hurl insults at me. But as George's care was demanding, I barely reacted to her. Maybe because I didn't respond to her verbal abuse, she started throwing things at me when she was drunk. Don't act all high and mighty cleaning our house. This is mine and George's home. Just stick to cooking or something, she yelled, splashing her drink on me. My head was drenched in alcohol, and some even spilled on George's bed. Stop it, please. It's getting on George, I begged, trying to stop her, but Lily, drunk, wouldn't listen. Don't order me around, you plague. You're the one weakening George. Her actions filled the room with a smell of alcohol. When Lily got like this, there was no stopping her until she was satisfied. Sometimes she would even hurl abusive words at George. George, maybe it's time for you to find peace. If this continues, my living expenses will turn into your medical bills. This woman will be happy to be rid of her caregiving duties. She mercilessly spoke such cruel words to her own brother. George just looked at her with tearful eyes. All I could do was protect George and wait for the violence to end. Lily's drunken rampages were always predictable. She spent her days outside, frequently visiting a nearby lottery ticket vendor. One time, she returned home in a very good mood with her arms full of paper bags stuffed with sweets, and the smell of cigarette smoke was strongly emanating from her clothes. I once asked her, "Where have you been?" She replied, "None of your business. Even if I win the lottery, I won't give you a dime," and snickered as she walked into her room. She must have been in a good mood to accidentally reveal her lottery habit. That was when I first learned Lily spent her days at the lottery ticket vendor. I was curious how she managed to fund her lottery habit, but I was too frightened by her outbursts to ask. Whenever the lottery didn't pay off, Lily would inevitably drink and take her frustration out on me. She would come home, pull out alcohol from the fridge, and demand, "Hey, make dinner." Since she often returned late at night, I would prepare meals and run her bath. Neglecting these tasks would result in her throwing things and screaming, so I never had a moment's peace. Despite this, I dedicated myself to caring for George 24/7, actively engaging in his rehabilitation. However, George grew increasingly frail and struggled even to breathe. After several months of my devoted care, George passed away. Though he was too weak to speak, he mustered the strength to thank me. "You've been a great help." "Thank you." Hearing these final words from George made all my hardships seem worth it. He had supported my marriage to his son, and after Tony's death, he offered to live with me, an outsider. George was my greatest benefactor. With his passing, I found myself alone again, but I couldn't afford to be sentimental. Lily didn't lift a finger to help with the funeral arrangements, leaving everything to me. It was only after the funeral that I could truly reflect on my time with George. Because of his caring nature, distant relatives gathered to pay their respects. During the post-funeral meal, everyone reminisced about George. Even Lily listened quietly to the relatives' stories. He always stood by us, one said. Right, he was always there when we needed him, added another. George had always been a man of action, never expecting anything in return for his help. Hearing this, I felt happy, as if they were talking about me too. Then a relative broached the subject. What about the inheritance? There should be land and real estate left. Yeah, he inherited his wife's assets too, so it must be a considerable amount. Despite the funeral just ending, they started discussing the inheritance. Hearing this, Lily's eyes lit up. Right, I'm the closest blood relative, so I'll protect George's inheritance. Besides, I've been taking care of him, so I have a right to inherit, she confidently declared. Watching Lily's eyes sparkle, I felt a deep sense of unease. But I couldn't avoid the inheritance discussion. As the relatives were getting worked up over the inheritance, a man suddenly entered. Everyone looked at him, but judging by the relatives' faces, no one seemed to recognize him. Amid the strange atmosphere, the man handed out his business card and said, I've been entrusted with the will. Lily, sensing an opportunity, approached the lawyer and said, Really? Then let's open the will right here. Her eyes were shining again as she pulled the lawyer to a seat. The lawyer took out the will from his bag and began to read it in a calm manner. Lily's face turned red immediately. The relatives also became restless. The will stated that all of George's estate was entrusted to me and nothing was left for his biological sister. I was as surprised as anyone. Even though I lived with George, I was still an outsider. That he entrusted his entire estate to me was unexpected. Hearing the lawyer's words, Lily lost her bright eyes, her face filling with anger and hatred. How can he leave the inheritance to some unknown woman? This is unacceptable, as George lost his mind. Lily yelled in a voice that was almost like a roar. She continued, After Marie passed away, it was me who lived with and struggled with George. What does this woman know about our lives? It's ridiculous to leave everything to her. She looked ready to pounce on me. Some relatives seemed to agree. Yeah, she lived with him for a long time. She's his real sister. Maybe there's a mistake in this will. Probably moved in for the inheritance. Yeah, maybe she manipulated him into writing the will. The relatives, perhaps upset they weren't receiving anything, started to speculate wildly. Internally, I thought they don't know the truth, but I knew any protest from me would play right into Lily's hands. As I remained silent and looked down, the relatives' mistrust in me seemed to grow. Just as they were about to discuss contesting the will, the previously silent lawyer spoke up. Decide what to do with this will after you see this, he said, placing an envelope and a USB memory stick on the table. Lily, with a puzzled expression, opened the envelope and a multitude of photos spilled out. They showed Lily in a rage, swinging around bottles of alcohol. She turned pale and clutched the photos tightly. As the relatives gathered and saw more photos, they found images of Lily throwing things at me and George, and her entering a lottery ticket vendor. There were also pictures of her withdrawing money from a bank ATM. The lawyer explained promptly, These are photos of her withdrawing George's pension without permission. I realized then that she had been using George's pension for her lottery expenses. Lily was out almost every day. I had noticed her frequent visits to the lottery place, but I didn't know where the money was coming from. I received a fixed amount for household expenses, so I had no way to investigate. Seeing these photos, the relatives who had been suspicious of me now turned their doubtful eyes towards Lily. What's the meaning of these photos? Did you withdraw money for the lottery without permission? One relative asked. Lily, struggling for an explanation, said, I did it because George said it was okay. I only got angry and threw things because that woman was being unreasonable. George knew about it and stayed quiet. Then the lawyer added, We have more evidence to show, and opened a laptop, plugging in the USB drive. The same scene of Lily swinging alcohol appeared on the screen, but this time with audio. George, when are you going to die? Once you do, I'll get your inheritance. You must be wishing for death too, Lily's voice was heard saying. Incredibly, it was all recorded with video and audio. According to the lawyer, George, fearing for his and my life, had hired him before his death. He had secretly installed cameras and hired a detective to tail Lily, capturing her actions outside. He wanted to ensure that his estate wouldn't end with his sister after his death, so he asked for the will to be backed up with these photos and videos. I was astonished. George, who in his later years could hardly move and struggled to speak, had planned all this. I was astounded by George's resourcefulness to the very end. Lily seemed to have lost the energy to argue any further, looking down and clenching her teeth. With all this evidence presented, she must have realized that any excuses would not convince the relatives. She downed a bottle of alcohol in one go and slumped over the table. After witnessing the video, the relatives were clearly not inclined to let Lily inherit the estate. Thanks to the will and the plethora of evidence the lawyer presented, I was the one who inherited the estate. Initially, I thought of declining the substantial inheritance. Even though it was George's wish, we were still strangers after all. I feared I might end up misusing the fortune, perhaps even in gambling like Lily. But the fact remained that George trusted me and treated me like family, even if it was for a short while. As a gesture of gratitude, I decided to use the inheritance to maintain George's grave for as long as I live. I had enough to live on from Tony's inheritance. I erected a tombstone for George and set up a grand altar, placing photographs of Tony, George, and Marie there. As for Lily, she succumbed to a gambling addiction and alcoholism and was forcibly admitted to a hospital. She likely won't leave it for the rest of her life. While I did feel a pang of pity, I couldn't forgive the years of torment she put me through. Still, as George's biological sister, I thought it right to cover her hospital expenses. Now alone again, my situation was different from before. I had something to protect, and that alone made me feel not so solitary. From now on, I plan to live out my remaining days peacefully in the house I shared with George.